Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for coming. Before we ask our two distinguished authors to share their work with us, I thought that I would say a few words and then invite Raza Rumi, my colleague, to also contribute so that we can set the context for the conversation just a little bit. In my wanderings around, I am often asked why I did this book on the Sufis. I am not a religious, I would like to say, though I am a believing Muslim, I am not an authority on religion, but I'm an explorer, and like the Sufis I admire, I left my home to go far away and serve mankind. So it's a very interesting moment in time because images of Islam accessible to the world are characterized by the sensationalism of the news media, limited by stereotypes of popular culture, and the misunderstood voice of fundamentalist Islam comes to represent the entire Muslim community. So it collapses the diverse ethnic identities from Malay to Kashmiri to Moroccan into the image of a jihadist. The reality is that the Muslim world is a vast, diverse, and complex civilization made up of many ethnicities, languages, and nationalities, and many different interpretations of the Holy Quran. So, you know, what is interesting about our authors is that they have also worked to shed some light from their personal lens on this very complex, very old, and very consuming search. Exposure to the historical context of Islamic cultural development is the best way to counter the violent ways Islam is being redefined by fundamentalists to mean something it was never meant to mean. Islam is not about violence and intolerance. Really, the guiding light of Islam, the Holy Quran, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the law, which is Sharia, have to be studied in great detail in order to reflect the diversity and the resources of the worldviews. These are not simple things, and the currents of history and the deeper ones of religion are so intertwined that to discover what they mean requires embarking on the personal quest that the Sufis told us about. And it should really begin there with your own search for yourself and your soul. So I will just, before we introduce our authors, want to say that for me, the definition of Sufism came from the great Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi, who used to pray a prayer which begins, "Enter me, O Lord, into the deep of the ocean of thy infinite oneness." And in the treatises of the Sufis, this ocean is mentioned again and again, likewise by way of symbolic reference to the end towards which the path of a Sufi is directed. So I think that we begin by saying that the answer, or the brief answer to what is Sufism is a revelation. It's like a tidal wave from the ocean of infinity to the shores of our finite world. And Sufism is the vocation and the discipline and the science of plunging into the ebb of one of these waves and being drawn back with it to its eternal and infinite source. Jürgen Wasim Fremgen is the chief curator of the Oriental Department of the Museum of Ethnology in Munich, as well as professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Munich. He conducts regular ethnographic fieldwork in Pakistan, and he has more than 100 English and German language publications to his credit. With Oxford University Press, he has published Journey to God, Sufis and Darwishes in Islam, At the Shrine of the Red Sufi, which I had the great honor of being part of the launch, and the movie that he made about that journey, and Music in the Land of the Sufis, Unheard Pakistan. He has written extensively on the cultures of the Eastern Muslim world between Iran and India, focusing particularly on Pakistan. In addition, he has curated numerous exhibitions dealing with the cultures of the Muslim world. So I am going to ask Raza now to say a few words before he introduces our second and wonderful author, Michel Boivin. I'll leave this for you to read from. Raza Rumi.
Well, thank you, Samina. That's very egalitarian of you. But it's a real privilege to be here again, and especially with Michel Boivin and Jürgen Wasim, and of course Samina Qureshi, who all are sort of my favorite authors who I look forward to reading all the time and learning a lot from what they have to say and what they have to muse about. I unfortunately got the access to books only 2 days ago, and I've been sort of cramming them and doing a crash reading, so to speak. But whatever I have picked up from these two excellent books is absolutely fascinating. And before I do that, I would like to introduce Michel Boivin. Dr. Michel Boivin is a research fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies in Paris and teaches contemporary history of South Asia at the University of Lyon. He also heads the Center for Social Sciences in Karachi, hosted by the French Cultural Center Alliance Française de Karachi. Trained in history and Islamic studies, Dr. Boivin specialized on the 19th and 20th century Muslim societies and cultures of South Asia. His work currently focuses on the Sufi culture of Sindh, and Dr. Boivin has authored about 70 academic papers and 10 books. That's a rather impressive range of his achievements. Just a few words to set the context. I have been following Jürgen Wasim's earlier book, which came out last year. That was also on Seven, and from a different perspective. And it is Michel Boivin's work comes almost as if a related sequel. Because that also looks at the compound of Seven Sharif, one of the most revered shrines in South Asia, and both for its archaeology and its access and its design, but also for the whole Kalandriya order that shrine represents, because it's a revolt from within the folds of formalized, institutionalized Sufi orders. And that is what makes this study most fascinating as one goes through, particularly as he looks into, without being didactic or judgmental, he looks into the history of artifacts, into the various motifs that are employed at the shrine, into the number of monuments. For example, I've been there, but I didn't know that some of them existed. And also looks at the various aspects of material culture and relates them to the ancient past, ancient and rather glorious, inclusive past of Sindh, which has been built layer over layer, and you can see how it has absorbed centuries of thought and mystical practice within that. But what of course came as a real pleasure was that I was reading Jürgen Wasim's book till late in the night, and his peculiar style, also known as a kind of a literary anthropology, in which basically as an empathetic ethnographer, he gets into the mold of the subject and travels along the subject. And this book of his particularly focuses on music and his various initiation, various stages of his familiarity with the Sufi music, from initiation to its understanding. But the style is almost as if written like a novel, if I would say it in lay terms, because it is lyrical, it is very, very touching at times, it is very, very absorbing, very accessible, and at the same time it brings out all the profundities that one is associated with the various complex intonations and underpinnings of Sufi music. And I would not take more time, and I would like this session, if Samina would agree, that we could request the authors to briefly talk about their work and do a reading and followed by a Q&A and some comments if Dr. Samina has to contribute at a later stage. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, in this book I wanted to show further diversity of Sufism, knowing that my main topic was to study the social and cultural impact of Sufism. So this is the main point. And also what I want to add is that it was partly the result of a collective work completed by a team, a research group with a number of participants from Pakistan, France, but also other countries like Germany, Austria, and even the USA. So we were very interested to understand how what we call the Sufi culture influenced the local life, if I can say. And there were mainly two main process under study. The first one is what we call the process of vernacularization, to understand to what extent the Sufi were able to adapt their message coming from the central Muslim world, Arabic country, speaking countries, to adapt this message in local culture. How did they use the local patterns in the literature, but also in the field of architecture and in other fields? It was the main thing, the first one. And the second axis of research was also to focus on regional or even local sites, because very often the studies devoted to Muslim culture in South Asia focus on what I call imperial cities mainly, even if it is not only the Mughal city like Lahore or the many in northern India, but also on other kingdom like Hyderabad and so on. But in middle town, because Sewan Sharif was never a capital of Sindh or I don't know what, but how finally the patterns, to what extent the cultural pattern are they coming from this center like Lahore for the Indus Valley, and if they were borrowed from this imperial center, how they were also adapted in the local cultural idiom. So this was our main axis of research, and also through this axis we wanted to understand the entanglement between social structures, local social classes, and all this spirituality, how some given social groups were able to manage it, how the negotiation between the local society and outsiders coming to Sewan were also negotiated. So we tried to study all this topic. Now? Yes, and in trying to understand the entanglement between the social structures and the spirituality, for example, we focused on the what we call the artifacts. So there are a number of artifacts, different categories of artifacts, but one of the more fascinating category is the relics, the objects, the instrument attributed to Lal Shabazz calendar, and one of the most fascinating, and it's a real artifact since it is a beautiful object, is the Kishti. So since I was asked to read an abstract, it is the one devoted to the Kishti. Yes. One of the most significant attributes of the calendar in the 13th century India was the kashkul. The kashkul is a bowl with which the wandering fakir begged mainly for food. Between the 11th and the 13th century, the kashkul was symbolized through a series of metonymic processes such as the wine boat or kishti, with wine being the symbol of illumination and mystical knowledge. In 17th century Iran, the kishti was used exclusively by the calendar. Its shape gradually began to resemble that of a boat, with the enlarged hull and the two raised edges, the stern and the bow. Interestingly, in Persian sorry. Interestingly, in Persian poetry, wine as a source of mystical knowledge is often associated with the ruby, referred to as lal in Persian. The kishti is thus obviously a decisive factor in Sufi initiation of the Kalandaria. One can presume that wine has currently been replaced by bang, a local decoction made with cannabis indica, some other herbs, and sometimes milk. Speaking of the Kalandar's kashkul in Sewan, Richard Burton wrote in the 19th century that it was, I quote, the dried good from which he pours the kalandar, the libation to Bacchus, and in which he receives the alms of the charitable. The importance attributed to the kashkul by the kalandar is also highlighted in the adab-e kashkul. According to this adab, a kalandar might ask another kalandar what the adab-e kashkul is, to which the answer should be, I quote, before it his daily bread, behind its death, to the right the heaven, on the left hell. Below it is the animal that supports the earth, the bull, and above it the firmament.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely.
It's a beautiful book and it's illustrative. So please take a look at it because the illustrations and photography is important in all of the things that Dr. Boivin has described. So I hope you'll have a chance to look.
And I think we should also request Jurgen and Wasim to read something, and you can go to the dais if you so wish. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I'm more comfortable staying over here and reading out from the lectern. So what I wanted to say is, when I started my field work in Pakistan annually about exactly 30 years ago, doing participant observation on different kind of dimensions of culture in Pakistan, over most of the provinces in Pakistan as well, there's one lesson I really learned in Pakistan from the people, and this is humility. And I think the anthropology, I'm an anthropologist basically, and in my sense, in my view, anthropology is the science of humility. And something which I really received as a gift from Pakistan, from the people, from my friends, from my acquaintances, is a deep sense of emotional warmth. And now when I changed and simply, in addition to academic work, I'm trying now to write narratives. What Raza said is also has a novel kind of style or genre. I hope I can somehow give something back for the warmth I received. This book on music, much like the previous one on my pilgrimage to Sevan Sharif, comes out of participant observation. At times you could even say it is a kind of dense participant observation, and what anthropologists like Clifford Geertz and others try to do is to describe it in a condensed way, to give dense descriptions of performances, of events, of encounters, of conversations. And it was, I think, in the after 1996 that I really discovered this dimension of not only of Sufi music but also of classical music in Pakistan. And I have to pay my respects to a number of very dear friends, and one of them I devoted the second chapter of this book, Dr. Ishfaq Khan from Lahore, who, so to speak, initiated me in listening. And the book is also about that I want to open the ears of Westerners to tune more to Hindustani music, to music from this part of the world. I think, in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, right up to the early 80s, younger people in Europe were much more open and keen in listening to classical music, to khayal gaiki, to qawwali, to folk music. And unfortunately, I don't see this among the younger generation. So if I ask my students if they have heard the name of Ustad Fateh Ali Khan, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, they know who is he, have never heard, not to speak of Abda Parveen. And they don't know what is a chimta, they don't know anything about Bhangra even in Germany. So I'm a bit disappointed, and I try my best to that their perception of listening might hopefully change, and that they really appreciate the depth of music in Pakistan. So this was one of my motivations. And of course, I realize also that it might be interesting even for the younger generation in Pakistan also to appreciate their musical heritage. So these are basically the motives I wrote the book. And if I'm allowed, I would love to read out a passage. So the book is again, like the previous one, divided in 5 chapters and a kind of narrative style. The first one brings you to a mela and urs full of music in the salt range called Musical Nights in the Wilderness. Far away, you have to reach that shrine, Sufi shrine on a footpath. The second one I'm reading out now, a paragraph, is called The Music Rooms of Lahore. The third one deals with the trance rhythms at the shrine of Shah Jamal in Lahore. The fourth one, you can accompany me if you like, on a pilgrimage to Pak Patan, to Baba Farid. And the fourth one is on Bhicha, so on Sindh, the voices of the fakirs at the king's court. And the most crucial experience for me had been in 1996 at the Delhi Muslim Hotel in Anarkali, where I wandered around in the evening. I came over from India, and I heard the sounds of a tabla playing, some sound coming from the courtyard of the Delhi Muslim Hotel. And upon inquiring, I realized that there would be a mehfil, sama, or if you a musical mehfil, presided by Ghulam Maharaj Khatak, the famous Kathak dancer from Pakistan, who passed away 2 years later, and Ustad Hamid Ali Khan, the Saital singer, was about to perform. And that really changed my perception. I had been listening to Indian music since my youth, in the 1970s, definitely so, also fusion music. But sometimes fusion gets into confusion. So I have become a purist about appreciating Pakistani music. So, in the course of the evening, more preparations were made for the mehfil on the terrace in front of the hotel room in which Babaji had been living for over 15 years now. Servants spread out carpets and decorated the side wall with cloths interwoven with threads of gold and silver on which invocations to God and the Prophet were embroidered. They placed pots with fragrant white jasmine on the terrace, sprinkled the ground with rose water, installed microphones and loudspeakers, and arranged cushions for the guests. Within virtually no time, a separate semi-private space for the performance was created. When Maharaj Kathak finally emerged from his room and took his place in the first row of those waiting in a semicircle around the musicians, one of his friends quickly placed a silver bowl with pan and a large brass spittoon before him. Now the performance with the singer Hamid Ali Khan was ready to begin. This versatile artist, schooled in all classical styles, who belongs to a famous school of musicians, restricted himself, in accordance with the host's wishes, entirely to ghazals and accompanied himself on the harmonium. I still recall certain songs he sang with homoerotic content, whose Urdu verses are so clear and pronounced, full of devotion and longing, and with a remarkable warm timbre. They include Targe Mohabbat Kar Bete Hum, and most of all, Sirf Ehsaas Ki Aankhon Se Nazar Aunga, visible only through the eyes of feelings. However, it was not only because of certain ghazals that this night became an outstanding event for me, but particularly because of the special atmosphere and the authentic context in which music lovers felt fully included. They demonstrated their admiration for the poet and musical expression, and also their own delight, through hand gestures and calls of praise such as wah wah, subhanallah, kya kehna, or kya baat hai. Ghazal lovers rapidly exchanged in those days 100 rupee notes for bundles of 2 rupee notes, tossed the notes into the air and showered them on Maharaj Katak and the vocalist in a traditional gesture called veil, which I experienced here for the first time. Those present were linked by the feeling of a common bond and closeness. Anthropologists call this communitas. I too was included in the lyrical musical event and moved by the subtleness of the ghazal songs, felt as if I were part of it, exchanging looks with the listeners seated next to me. In this way, we shared our impressions. Pan, water, and later tea were continually passed around to the guests, again and again touching gestures of respect for the 19-year-old Maharaj Katak, which I can never forget. Banknotes which his admirers circled over his head to consecrate them, persons arriving who touched his feet respectfully, friends who scattered fragrant rose petals over us. When a servant finally distributed pan wrapped in silver foil among the members of the audience, the master called me to him, shoved a pluck with sweet betel in my mouth, and said jokingly that his group of friends was really a pandan, khandan, a family which gets together over the betel box. He asked whether I knew the story of a prince from Lahore who chewed pan every evening in his palace, and from his balcony expectorated onto the street below. One unfortunate day, he confused this procedure, expectorated in his room, and jumped from the balcony, from which we see that chewing pan is a bad habit. Only some time later did I notice that off to the side of a policeman with a loaded gun was standing guard while another was positioned on the roof of a house nearby. Apparently, even private or semi-private concerts of this kind could become a target for religious extremists. With some concern, I observed an elderly man with a long beard and white prayer cap, to all appearances an Orthodox Muslim, who had initially remained at the edge of our semicircle and looked on without showing the slightest feeling. However, with time, his stern facial expression seemed to soften. Finally, I noticed how he gave the two musicians some banknotes and then sat down with the rest of us in the semicircle. Thank you.
So, well, given that we have limited time left, we should open up the session to Q&A and perhaps let the audience interact and ask questions and comments. Okay, the mic. Prior to that, before the mic goes in, I want to add that one of the best chapters in Jurgen Wasim's book is his visit to Pak Patan, where he spends the night and looks at the Qawwali. There. Qawwali and how the various stages of Qawwali take place and how the night unfolds and the particular poetic emphasis that the Qawwals are making. I think it's a must-read chapter if you ever get down to buying this book.
Is it open for questions?
Yes.
All right, great. My name is Karim Aman. I have some comments about the term used in social impact of Sufism. We need to problematize, and I'm sure the writers must have problematized the word impact because of the Sufi narrative personal quest. How much in today's world we can speak about the impact of personal quest at social level. And the second point is the Sufi Islam, which was practiced once, it was not limited to individual or personal search in subcontinent. It has official patronage of rulers as well. That's why what happened is the personal search turned into a Sufi movement, ultimately impacting the social milieu of its time. But today we can't find any such authority or central figure which can turn this personal search into some sort of social movement so that we have some social impact.
So the question, because that was a statement.
Yeah, the question is, is there any authority, is there any movement in today's world where we can refer, they found any such central authority where they all, the forces of Sufi forces, they come closer and they can counter, or they should present their narrative of Islam as compared to the orthodox narrative of Islam.
Let's take another question and then we can perhaps come back to this.
Yeah, I would just like to add there, as in my opinion, as many Islams as they are Muslims, many local forms of Islam, of course, and it's important in my opinion that it's a lived practice and concrete practice, and that there had been in the subcontinent a kind of lived Islam where people for all the centuries since the Sultanate period were not conscious that they were Sufis at all. They wouldn't call themselves Sufis, but simple Muslims. But these Muslims were practicing a really Sufi-inspired Islam. So that is my short idea on that.
Okay, the guy.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, both of you. My name is Jürgen Schaflechner, and I have a question to Jürgen Wasim Fremdgen. And it's going to be a question about yourself. I mean, I know you're writing ethnography, you're an anthropologist, but my question is, you shifted a little bit from, I mean, you mentioned Clifford Geertz a little bit, but you shifted from a more academic approach to writing of a narrative or a travelogue. So my question is, where is the Jürgen in the travelogue the protagonist, and where is he the author? To frame it in a different way, what is the relation between your protagonist in the book, which is written in a first-person narrative, and the author?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jürgen, for the comments. My own Jürgen was left behind in Germany, I guess, when I was writing this. And of course, I haven't left the part of academic studies. I can't. It's also my bread and butter in a way. But my love has gone more and more into writing these narratives. And we both know in anthropology that has just since the 60s, since the books of Claude Lévi-Strauss, Triste Tropique, since Laura Bohannon, Victor Turner, Margaret Mead, of course, Bronislaw Malinowski in the beginning, they have tried to reflect about the experiences. And these kind of emotional experiences have become so intense for me. It's about intensity, I think. I realized when I attended the Urs and the Mela in Sewan, and you see, since 9 years now going there, that the academic language was more and more inadequate for me, and that I had to look for a different style of writing. And yes, there's a discussion in the writing culture movement. Is that now still non-fiction? Is it fiction? Anthropologists say it is maybe true fiction, keeping in mind that the root of the word fiction comes from the Latin word fingere, which has a craft aspect, something which is written, which is made, which is produced, and I think I can identify with it. Krapanzanu, another of our colleagues who works in Morocco, has seen it a bit in a different way. I'm not fully subscribing what he said. He used the idea of the Greek god Hermes, who would promise not to lie, but also was clear not to say the whole truth. So somewhere it's in between. We are dealing with reflexivity, with authenticity. We try to treat that fragile balance between subjectivity and objectivity, but of course it's much more that we as anthropologists in conversing with people, we are really the tool of our research work. It's through us, so it's a very subjective way. But I think it's important. What's it all about? It's about understanding other cultures. I think if we achieve that to a certain extent, this is already a lot. Thank you.
Mr. Fremdgen, You read out a piece and you said you attended this mehfil or majlis for Maharaj Khatak, where that, what's his name, he was going to sing.
Ustad
Hamid
Hamid
Ali.
Ali Khan.
Hamid Ali. And he was specifically told to sing ghazals.
Ji haan.
Was there a particular reason for that? Because he's a classical singer
No,
and Maharaja Khatak is a classical dancer.
Ji haan. But of course, because Maharaj Katak, I mean, he was very much, he liked Tumris and Ghazal, that was his favorite genre, what he was listening to. So that was his particular request in that evening. No?
Thank you.
Yeah, please, Dr. Tariq Rahman at the back, right there.
First of all, I'd like to thank both speakers who have done excellent work. Actually, a lot of work on Pakistan. All kinds of research have been done by foreigners, and because they've done this work, they've become us. That's the first thing. Secondly, I'd like to point out that there was no central authority backing all Sufis. The relationship between the Sohrawardis and the Sufis was a good relationship. Shaykh Bahauddin Zakaria, for instance, took lands from the state and so on and so forth. The relationship between the Chishtis and the central government was not always a good one. So it wasn't that the central government always backed them. That is not true. In fact, what has happened recently in Pakistan is when the central government starts backing any of the groups, let's say when they back the Deobandis, that's when an official Islam comes into being, and there are problems then. So it's the public which either backs or withdraws. And when there is an official backing of one, the public tends to withdraw, and that has been our problem. So what we should do now is to advocate the central government not to intervene in the faith of the people. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. We would like to thank our distinguished authors. We encourage you to look at their beautiful work. I would also like to say that all of us are concerned about the understanding that we must put together. So, transformation of the soul through tribulation and purification is one of Sufism's defining themes. That's what the Lal Shahbaz Qalandar manifests and the work of these two great scholars. So they do this, the Sufis, through constant meditations and spiritual reflection. It's not an easy thing to do. It's the practice of love for fellow mortals, which we in Pakistan really need to practice. And even for those with different creeds, we must live our time on this earth as the one wishes of us in order to earn his love, and he wishes lives of virtue and good works, not the mere avoidance of evil, but the positive advancement of good. So let's work for a better, more understanding, more open-minded Pakistan. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you, Yasmin, Raza, our guests, Michel Boivin and Jürgen Wasim Fremgen. I can see there were a lot of questions and comments coming in, but since we were pressed for time, we couldn't take any more. However, if you would like to get your book signed or meet and speak with the authors, thank you, you could do that outside at the author signing booth. Please wait till our guests are escorted out of the hall. Please remain seated, and then you can go outside and meet them. Thank you very much.